The treaty on Russia's protectorate over Georgia aroused the fury of the century-old enemies of Georgia, Iran and Turkey. In 1795, the hordes of the Iranian Shah Aghamagomkan invaded Azerbaijan, but they met with strong resistance. In September of the same year, they attacked Georgia. Such a terrible invasion has not happened since the times of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane. The city of Tiflis was turned into ruins. Over 10,000 captured Georgians were taken to Iran. Early in 1798, the elderly Irakli II died, leaving his kingdom in a state of decay and impotence. The son of Irakli, George XII, became the king of Georgia, when new violent intestine wars broke out in Georgia. Georgi XII swore allegiance to Russia as her vassal and sent an embassy to St. Petersburg with petition points about Georgia's accession to Russia. At the end of 1800, he died without waiting for the manifesto of Paul I to join. Later, on January 18, 1801, this manifesto was published, but because of Paul's death the question again remained unformed. The new Russian Emperor Alexander I issued in September 1801 the Manifesto on Georgia's accession, for the abhorrence of the sorrows of the Georgian people. Eastern Georgia became a Russian region and soon became known as the Tiflis province. Georgia turned into a colony of Tsarist Russia. This was the least evil for the Georgian people. Weakened and ruined by continuous wars and internal uprisings, Georgia experienced a serious social and economic crisis and could not defend itself from the enemy. Georgia's accession to such a powerful power as the Russian Empire was, then saved the Georgian people from complete enslavement of it by Shah's Iran or Sultan Turkey. Russia was close to Georgia on religion and culture, and in those historical conditions was the only progressive force capable of ensuring the further development of the productive forces of Georgia. The Wars of Russia with Iran, 1805, 1813, and Turkey, 1806, 1812. After the annexation of eastern Georgia to Russia in 1801, the Tsarist government annexed Mingrelia, Guharia and Imeritia to Russia. This rounding of the Transcaucasian possessions took place not only with the help of weapons, but also through cunning diplomacy and bribery. Appointed in late 1802, the commander-in-chief, Prince Sichianov, skillfully used the constant feudal discord and peasant uprisings against the feudal lords to establish the power of Tsarist Russia in Transcaucasia. Part of the Georgian feudal lords sought to return their feudal privileges and to restore the Georgian kingdom under Iran's protectorate. The most implacable of the feudal lords, the son of Heraclius II, Prince Alexander, along with other dissatisfied princes, went to Iran to gather forces there against Russia. In 1804, Sichianov launched an offensive against the Yerevan Khanate. After a 2-month siege of Yerevan fortress, he had to retreat. At the end of 1805, Sichianov undertook a campaign against the Baku Khanate, the mastery of which was necessary for access to the Caspian Sea, and also for further struggle with Iran. Sichianov imposed a Baku fortress and demanded that he give him the keys to the fortress gates. The Baku Khan pretended to agree, but a half-verst from the city during the talks, Sichianov was killed by a shot in the back of one of the Proxima Khans. His head was sent to Iran as a gift to Shah's heir. The Baku Khanate was annexed only in the autumn of 1806, after the death of Sichianov. At the same time, the Kuban Khanate, which was adjacent to the Baku Khanate, was also annexed. From the annexed Khanates of Azerbaijan, 2 provinces were formed, Elizavetpol and Baku. Iran and Turkey, supported by Britain and France, did not agree to a concession to the Russian Tsar of Caucasian and Transcaucasian possessions. The British and French governments helped them with money and weapons, pushing them to a war with Russia. In 1805, Iran declared war on Russia, and at the end of 1806, Turkey. Both wars dragged on for many years. Iran was assisted by Napoleon, who sent his instructors and engineers. England also led in Iran and Turkey the policy of inciting these countries against Russia. But, despite the enormous numerical superiority and the help of French and English instructors, the armies of Iran and Turkey suffered a series of severe defeats. Under the concluded agreement, Iran renounced claims to Dagestan and Georgia. Russia got the right to keep warships on the Caspian Sea. Russian merchants were granted privileges. The war with Turkey was on two fronts, Transcaucasian and Balkan. It ended with the Bucharest Peace of 1812, according to which Russia received Bessarabia. In Asia, between Russia and Turkey, the former borders were restored. Turkey renounced its claims to western Georgia, which was subsequently turned into Kutaisi province. The war between Russia and Iran lasted until 1813. The mediator in the end of the war was England, which, in alliance with Tsarist Russia, sought to end the war with Napoleon. The victories of the Russian army in Transcaucasia forced Iran to go to the conclusion of the Gulistan Peace, 1813, by which the Khanates located on the territory of present-day Azerbaijan joined Russia. Transcaucasia after accession to Russia. The external security that Georgia received with its accession to Russia saved the Georgian people not only from physical destruction, but also from the forced planting of the Muslim religion. The inclusion of Transcaucasia in the Russian Empire contributed to its transition to the path of capitalist development. At the turn of the X8, XIX centuries, in Georgia dominated by subsistence farming, the peasant family produced not only bread, but also fabrics, shoes, household items. The cities of Georgia were not yet the focus of the industrial life of the country. Only in Tiflis was, although in its infancy, industry, cannon, powder and glass factories, printing plants, meant. In the first years after accession to Russia, trade in Georgia developed very slowly due to lack of roads, due to constant unrest within the country and because of the war on the borders of Georgia. Merchants and the Armenian merchants traded. They took raw silk and wool to Moscow and to the Makarievsky Fair. To promote the development of local trade, the Russian authorities destroyed the internal outposts. Thanks to a preferential customs tariff for foreign goods, Tiflis became an intermediary in the trade of France and Germany with Persia. But the tariff that operated in Transcaucasia was unprofitable for Russian merchants and manufacturers, and they achieved in 1831 its cancellation. In Azerbaijan, the so-called curfew management was introduced. The Khanate was renamed the province. At their head stood commandants from Russian officers. In all the annexed lands, the system of feudal oppression of the population, especially the peasantry, was strengthened. The Tsarist government sought to find support among the Georgian landlords and demanded that the peasants obey them unquestioningly. The insurrection of the peasants was pacified with the help of military force. The intensified feudal oppression was added to the peasant colonial oppression. If earlier the prince and his retinue rode and plundered the peasant settlements, now Russian and Georgian officials and officers went hunting and for weeks lived and fed at the expense of the Georgian peasantry. Court and management were conducted in Russian. The peasants did not understand him and were defenseless. Unreasonable requirements for the supply of provisions, conveyances, forced work on the construction of roads led to continuous peasant unrest and insurrections. In the spring of 1804, an uprising of peasants, exhausted by road service, broke out in the mountainous Georgia, along the Georgian military road. The rebels took over the entire military Georgian road. The insurrection lasted for several months and was suppressed only with the help of troops that arrived from the Caucasus Line. The uprising of peasants in South Ossetia, which began in 1809, lasted a whole year. But the most formidable was the uprising in 1812-1813. In Kakheti, here the peasants had to serve the army transports with cattle, arbas, people, which completely upset their economy. The terrible famine and plague completed the calamities of the peasants. The uprising broke out in January 1812 in the village of Ahmedi in Tel Aviv. The peasants unanimously protested at the sound of the bell. In a few days the uprising swept across 3 counties. The uprising was hardly suppressed until 1813. 30. The people of Volga region, Bashkiria and Siberia in the first quarter of the XIX century. Peoples of the Volga region, solidly settled in the Middle Volga region, the Russian landowners, as well as landlords from baptized Tatars and princes, continued to seize the black earth lands of local peasants in the forest steppe regions. In the steppe, where the settlements continued, Chuvash and Mari, Tatars and Mordvins were driven. The peasants were deprived of the best lands along the rivers. According to the so-called Act of General Land Reclamation 1765, the lands of local peasants were assigned to Russian colonial landlords. In numerous petitions of the Tatars, Chuvashs, and Mari, subordinated to the Kazan governor, the peasants complained of a cut in their mowing, pastures and plow lands. From the second half of the XVIII century, the peoples of the Volga region were subjected to violent baptism. Entire villages, the Tsarist authorities drove the Chuvash and Mordovians into the river and baptized everyone in a heap. Often they were lured with gifts. Each baptized was given a cross, a ruble, a white shirt. In unbaptized Tatars and sultans, according to a special order of the government, the serfs were taken away. Colonizing the lower Volga region, the government resettled their Tatars, Mordvins and Chuvashes from the areas of the Middle and Upper Volga. Together with the Russian people, these peoples initiated the economic and cultural development of the lower Volga region. In the second half of the XVIII century, on both sides of the Volga, around Saratov and below it, the villages of the German colonists grew up. In order to quickly master the vast steppes, the government of Catherine II in 1763 issued a manifesto inviting foreign settlers to Russia. For this challenge, more than 20,000 people from France, Sweden and especially Germany, whose peasants were devastated by the 7 Years' War, settled on the banks of the Volga. Settlers foreigners received 30 desiatines per family and a loan for the establishment. They soon turned into the most prosperous and reactionary part of the rural population, contemptuous and hostile to Russian residents. In the lower Volga region, the settlements of Ukrainian Chumaks were founded, caused from Ukraine for breaking in the carriage of salt from Lake Elton. Behind Tsaritsyn were the lands of a Cossack army, guarding the Volga region from attacks by nomads, Kalmyks and Kazakhs. The growth of the domestic market and the export of grain abroad have increased the demand for landlord bread. In search of new lands for plowing, the landowners energetically seized the steppes of the Volga region. In the last quarter of the XVIII and in the first quarter of the XIX century, all the empty lands of the Volga region, which were in the government department, were distributed to noblemen and various state officials. Especially a lot of land was distributed in the reign of Paul I. One of his approximate, Naryshkin, Paul I. granted over 500,000 desiatines of land. Tens of thousands of desiatines of land were distributed to other landlords up to 1820, when a decree was issued prohibiting the distribution of land on the upland, right side of the Volga. The Russian landowners selected in their possession the lands assigned to peasants of different nationalities who had resettled in the lower Volga region earlier. The colonial oppression and merciless exploitation of the peoples of the Volga region caused peasant uprisings. The most significant were during this period the Mordvinian uprising in the Nizhny Novgorod province, 1808-1810. The peasants of the Tyrashevskoye Volost crushed the landlord's office, killed the manager and seized the harvest from the landowners' fields. The royal detachment, sent to suppress the uprising, was defeated by the peasants. In the forest there were secret meetings, on which the question of how to free the Mordvinians from the oppression of the Russian landowners was discussed. At the head of the movement was the serf peasant Mordvin Kuzma Alexeyev. The government arrested all the leaders of the uprising. Alexeyev was accused of demanding for the Mordvins the right to wear national costumes and live according to Mordovian customs. The Tsar's court sentenced Alexeyev to punishment by whips and to exile to Siberia. The Bashkirs. The bulk of the Bashkir population in the first half of the XIX century was concentrated in the Orenburg province. At the beginning of the XIX century. At the beginning of the XIX century. At the beginning of the XIX century. Noble revolutionaries. The advanced people of serfdom under the influence of the beginning development of capitalism began to understand how the serfdom is a brake on the development of the country's productive forces. They were also convinced of the need to change the political system of the autocracy, in which millions of people were turned into slaves without rights. A huge revolutionary effect on the advanced Russian people from the nobles was also given to Radishchev, who even in the reign of Catherine II actively opposed the autocracy and serfdom. An impulse to the consciousness of the need to fight serfdom for many advanced people was the People's War of 1812. She made them think about the plight of the hard-hitting people, heroically fighting for their homeland, to seek a way out of this situation. The awakening of the political consciousness of the best part of the Russian educated nobility was also promoted by the advanced ideas of the French bourgeois revolution. Young patriotic officers, who took part in the War of 1812 and in foreign campaigns, studied the encyclopedists' Enlightenment ideas, read with passion the political writings of Montesquieu, Rousseau and other leading writers. Young noble revolutionaries studied bourgeois constitutions of different countries, discussed their advantages and applicability in Russia. The national liberation movement and revolutionary events in Europe, the Balkans, Italy and Spain, made an even greater impression on the advanced officers. From one end of Europe to another, Pastel wrote, "It's always the same. From Portugal to Russia, not excluding any state, not even England and Turkey, these two opposites, the spirit of transformation, the spirit of the time makes, so to speak, everywhere minds bubbling." The image of the leader of the Spanish ascetics of freedom, Riga, was for the nobility revolutionaries a symbol of the heroic struggle for freedom. The execution of Riga, 1823, caused among them an explosion of outrage and protest. Returning from foreign campaigns, the young officers particularly felt the sharp contrast between bourgeois Europe and feudal Russia. In feudal Russia they again saw the backwardness of the country's economy, serf slavery, universal ignorance, the arbitrariness of the autocracy. Especially they were indignant at the plight of the peasants and the urban lower classes. Leading noblemen concluded that, the attachment of peasants is the cause of all our internal disorders. In depicting the intolerable soldier's life, they pointed to the doom of a slave soldier who had to serve 25 years, who had no hope of returning to a family that had been subjected to severe drill, severe beatings, and hunger. 32. Rebellion December 14, 1825. Secret societies of noblemen revolutionaries. To reorganize the order in Russia, the revolutionary nobles created secret political organizations. Many Russian noblemen revolutionaries were first members of religious moral communities, Masonic lodges, using them for their political purposes. The first secret political society of the nobility revolutionaries was founded in 1816. It was called the Society of True and True Sons of the Fatherland, or the Union of Salvation. The founder of the society was Colonel Alexander Muravyov. In the society, there were 26 to 30 members. It aimed to liberate the peasants from serfdom and the introduction of a constitutional monarchy in Russia. Two currents have emerged in society, moderate and militant. The last was headed by Pavel Ivanovich Pastel. Internal disagreements on ideological and tactical issues led to the liquidation of the first secret society. To replace him in 1818, a new union was created, the Union of Prosperity 1818-1821. He was no longer such a narrow conspiratorial organization. It had 200 members. Local branches, councils were organized. The most revolutionary was the South Board. It was created by Colonel Pastel in Ukraine, in Tulchin. Under the influence of Pastel, the Union of Welfare spoke out for the Republican system in Russia. In January 1821 in Moscow, the Union Congress took place, at which acute internal disagreements were revealed. Moderate members of the Union declared the Union of Welfare dissolved. Pastel disagreed with the decision of the Congress and in 1821 created a new organization, Southern Society 1821-1825. The composition of the Southern Society included Pastel, Bestos Havryuman, Sergei Muravyov's Apostle, Davy Dov and others. The leader of the Southern Society was Pastel. He was a man of great intelligence, broad education, and a powerful character. Pushkin wrote about him, "Pastel is an intelligent man in the whole sense of the word, one of the most original minds I know." Pavel Ivanovich Pastel, born in 1793, received an excellent education. In 1812 he bravely fought against Napoleon and was wounded in the Battle of Borodino. Together with the Russian army participated in foreign campaigns of 1813–1815. The indignation of serfdom and arbitrariness in Russia, reading of political literature made Pastel a hot supporter of the revolution and the republic. From his youth Pastel was fond of social studies, studied the works of Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau and many other European thinkers. Pastel worked out a program for the constitutional transformation of Russia. He called it Russian Truth. According to Pastel's project, Russia, as a result of the coup, must become an indivisible republic with a strong centralized power. Pastel proposed to destroy all members of the imperial family. After the overthrow of the monarchy, the dictatorship of the Provisional Supreme Council should be declared. The highest authorities are three: the Supreme Legislative Body, the People's Vesh, the Supreme Executive Body, the State Duma and the Vigilant Body, the Supreme Council, which controls whether laws are properly executed. Pastel proposed the democratic structure of the republic. All classes are destroyed, all citizens have equal rights and enjoy the same freedoms. Neither property nor educational qualification is required for participation in elections. Russian Truth declared the liberation of the peasants with land and without any ransom. All the land suitable for cultivation is divided into two parts. Half of the land represents a public fund of land confiscated by the state from the landlords. From it every citizen can get an allotment. The land of this half is in communal ownership. It cannot be sold or bought. The second half of the land is made up of state and that part of the privately owned land that is not confiscated by the state. It was meant for abundance and could be bought and sold. Thus, Pastel's land project, although not completely destroying landlord land ownership, nevertheless severely undermined it. In 1822 the Northern Society appeared in St. Petersburg. It existed until 1825. It included the poet Rylev, Pushkin, Yakushkin and many others. The head of the Northern Society was the Guards officer Nikita Muravyov. In 1812 the young man Muravyov fled the house to the army and made a foreign campaign. Returning to Russia, he became one of the organizers of the secret Northern Society. Muravyov has carefully studied various European constitutions. Many features of these constitutions form the basis for the draft constitution that he developed. Under the project of N. Muravyov, Russia remained a monarchy. It should be headed by an emperor whose authority will be limited to the People's Chamber, consisting of two chambers: the upper chamber, or the Supreme Duma, and the lower one, the House of People's Representatives. The right to elect and be elected to the People's Vesh and especially to the Supreme Duma was owned only by the owners of movable or immovable property. Serfdom was abolished, but the land was preserved in the hands of the landlords. The peasants were to receive only estate plots, a hut, cattle and equipment. According to N. Muravyov's final project, each family of a serf peasant during the liberation was provided with a plot of 2 tithes. The project N. Muravyov caused criticism from the radical members of the Northern and Southern Societies. Primarily we need to solve the issue of land ownership, Pastel said. It is necessary to give land to the peasants. Only then will the goal of the revolution be achieved. A great role in the Northern Society was played by the poet Kondraty Fedorovich Rylev, 1795-1826. He also took part in the war with Napoleon in a foreign campaign. Military service did not satisfy him, and Rylev retired. In 1823 he began publishing, together with Bestuchev, the magazine Polar Star. This magazine, as well as the thoughts and the poems of Rylev, exerted a tremendous influence on the noble youth. In 1820 the name of Rylev gained popularity, as he was the first who dared to expose the temporary Iraq chief. Rylev joined the Northern Society in 1823. He took an active part in preparing the uprising on December 14, 1825. Rylev himself spoke of himself, "I'm not a poet, but a citizen." His poetry was imbued with civil motives, love of freedom, hatred of slavery. Rylev was one of the most ardent supporters of the struggle against Tsarism. He knew that defeat was possible, but he was imbued with the fervent belief in the ultimate victory of a just cause. These feelings Rylev perfectly described in the Confessions of Nalivayagi. "It is known to me, death awaits freedom without redemption. The one who first rebels I will perish for the land of my own, for the people's oppressors. I feel it, I know." Simultaneously with the Northern and Southern Societies in 1823 in Ukraine, in Volhynia there was another secret society called Society of United Slavs. Its founders were the officers' brothers Borisov, Gorbachevsky and others. The structure of this society included poor and low-ranking officers who were in small ranks, as well as noblemen who were not in military service. In the Society of United Slavs there was no developed program, but it was very emphatically stressed the need to destroy the Tsarist power and serfdom. Slavs demanded the creation of a federal democratic republic of all Slavic countries, while the members of the Northern and Southern Societies advocated a military coup prepared by a narrow circle of conspirators. Members of the Society of United Slavs also tried to agitate among the soldiers. In the summer of 1825, the Slavs adopted Pestel's program and merged with the Southern Society. Decembrist Revolt. In November 1825 Alexander I unexpectedly died in Taganrog. He had no children. On the throne was to enter his brother Constantine, but he still during the life of Alexander I refused a throne. Thus, the throne was to pass to the third brother, Nicholas. But since the act of abdication was kept secret, the troops and population of St. Petersburg, immediately after the death of Alexander I, were sworn in as Constantine. While the correspondence was going on between the brothers and the couriers traveled from St. Petersburg to Warsaw, where Constantine lived, and back. In the country there was an actual interim. In the ruling circles there was confusion, which was used by members of the Northern Society. They decided to withdraw on December 14, on the day of the oath to Nicholas. The troops on the street and, having refused the oath, demand a constitution. On the morning of December 14, 1825, regiments with commanders Decembrists came to the Senate Square. The total number of rebelling soldiers and sailors in the square was over 3,000. The troops built up in a square, a combat quadrangle, around the monument to Peter I, but remained inactive. The insurrection was not prepared, and the leaders did not show determination. Appointed dictator Sergei Trubetskoy at the last moment was afraid that the rebels had too little strength, and did not come to the square. Deprived leadership, the rebels lost their initiative in action. By 12 o'clock in the afternoon the new Tsar Nicholas I pulled the troops and artillery to the square. Serfs, craftsmen and the urban poor flocked to the Senate Square. The workers who built the St. Isaac's Cathedral threw logs aside, where the king and his troops were. By order of the Tsar against the insurgent soldiers, several horse attacks were made several times, but they were successfully repelled by a swarm of bullets flying from the square. Neither the entreaties of the commanders nor the exhortations of the Metropolitan could break the revolutionary determination of the insurgent soldiers. St. Petersburg Governor-General Milo Radovich, who tried to persuade the insurgents to disperse, was mortally wounded by one of the most determined Decembrists, Kakhovsky. On approaching the rebellious king was opened a cursory fire. But all these actions of the Decembrists did not carry the nature of the offensive. The Tsar, who had greatly overstrained, fearing that the excitement was not transmitted by the mob, ordered the shooting of grape shot. The columns of the insurgents were dispersed by the artillery fire. The Senate Square, the Neva embankment and the streets were strewn with corpses. At night, in the Neva, ice holes were made and they let down not only the dead, but also the wounded. The leaders of the uprising were arrested. The uprising of the Chernigov Regiment in Ukraine, which began on December 29, 1825, also suffered a defeat. On the eve of the events in St. Petersburg, Pestel, on the denunciation of the provocateur, was arrested. The uprising was led by Sergei Muravyov-Apostol. But, like in St. Petersburg, the Chernigovites did not dare to move to resolute offensive actions. More energetic members of the Society of United Slavs proposed sending an insurgent regiment to capture Kiev, where friendly military units were located. But the moderate leaders, led by Sergei Muravyov-Apostol, used expectant tactics. Instead of an offensive against Kiev, Sergei Muravyov-Apostol led troops from Vasilkov to the White Church, and then to Zhytomyr, counting on the annexation of units headed by members of the Southern Society. His calculations were not justified. Near the village of Kovalevka on January 3, 1826, the insurgent regiment met with government troops and was shot at by grape shot. The uprising on December 14, 1825. The uprising was suppressed. Tsar Nicholas I brutally dealt with the rebels. July 13, 1826. 5 Decembrists, Pestel, Ryliev, Kakhovsky, Muravyov-Apostol and Bestuzhev Ryumin were hanged. Many participants in the uprising were sent to Siberia for hard labor. The soldiers were driven through the system, giving them 10 to 12,000 shots with spikes, from which many immediately died. So the soldier Onoichenko died. According to the court verdict, he was to receive 12,000 blows. Many soldiers were exiled to the Caucasus, where at that time they were fighting the mountaineers. The uprising of the Decembrists ended in failure. The nobility revolutionaries were cut off from the people and did not count on the uprising of the masses. As supporters of the military conspiracy tactics, they were afraid of the mass movement and therefore were defeated. But the significance of the Decembrist speech is very great. This was the first open military uprising against Tsarism. Until that time in Russia there were only spontaneous peasant uprisings. For decades, the slogans of the Decembrists inspired Russian revolutionaries. The circle of these revolutionaries is narrow. They are terribly far from the people. But their business has not been lost. Lenin wrote about the Decembrists, Collected Works, Volume 18, p. 14. Evaluating this era in the history of the liberation struggle in the XX century, and the role of the Decembrist uprising in it, Lenin wrote, "This is the epoch from the Decembrists to Kherson. Fortress Russia is hammered and immobile. Protests an insignificant minority of nobles, powerless without the support of the people. But the best people from the nobility help to awaken the people." Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 19, pages 294-295. Chapter 7 Crisis of the Fortress System. 33. Monarchy of Nicholas I. Autocracy of Nicholas I, 1825-1855. Emperor Nicholas I reached power by crushing the Decembrist uprising. The preservation and strengthening of the autocratic system and serfdom became the main task of his reign. A smug mediocrity, with the horizons of a company commander, a man who took cruelty for energy and capricious stubbornness for willpower, who highly valued the external appearance of power and was ready to do everything for this visibility, was the new Russian emperor, according to Engels, K. Marx and F. Engels, SOCH, Volume XVI, Part 2, p. 24. The educator of Nicholas I was the Lambsdorff Colonel, who inspired him with admiration for the Prussian military discipline and the military police organization of the state. Another and advisor to Nicholas I was the Prussian King Friedrich Wilhelm III, whose daughter Charlotte Nicholas was married. Sympathy for the Prussian militarism allowed deep roots in the royal family. The Tsar himself had the greatest predilection for the Prussian orders. Even in his youth, he was merciless in the drill of the soldiers he commanded. Nicholas himself claimed that he felt happy only in the barracks. Here the order is strict, unconditional legality, no omniscience and contradiction. Everything follows from one another. Nobody orders before he himself learns to obey, Nikolai said. Cruel, stupid, self-confident, never reading books, Nicholas strictly adhered to the Arakcheyev orders. When one of the governors proposed the death penalty of 2 smugglers, Nicholas I imposed a resolution, guilty to drive through 1,000 people 12 times. Thank God, we did not have the death penalty, and it's not for me to introduce it. At the beginning of the XX century, the economic policy of Nicholas I in an effort to keep the dictatorship of the feudal landlords intact, Nicholas I was compelled to simultaneously support and attract merchants and manufacturers to his side. This policy was caused by the need to improve the economic and financial situation of the country. Trade and industry received government support through patronizing and prohibitive customs duties. In 1822, a tariff was introduced prohibiting the import of 3,110 types of goods and exportation 21. With minor changes, this tariff was also in effect during the reign of Nicholas I to meet the needs of industry and qualified specialists. Special educational institutions were created. The Technological Institute, the Forest Institute and others. From time to time industrial exhibitions were held. In 1851, Russian industrial products were first sent to the World Exhibition in London. In the interests of strengthening the Russian ruble, Finance Minister Kankarin carried out a monetary reform. He restored the metal circulation in the country. In the first half of the XX century, was issued a huge number of paper assignations. The ruble exchange rate by banknotes hardly reached the fourth part of the value of the silver ruble. The government bought out depreciated banknotes and, having withdrawn them from circulation, established a new monetary unit, a silver ruble. The previously issued paper credit tickets were exchanged for silver from the calculation of the ruble per ruble. In the interests of industry and trade, the government began to develop transport and improve roads. In 1837 a railway was built between St. Petersburg and Pavlovsky, a stretch of 24 versts. The first railway in Russia and the first domestic locomotive were built in 1833, 1835. At the Nizhny Tagil factories by outstanding Russian masters Novator Yefim Alexeyevich Cherepanov and his son Myron Efimovich. The Cherepanov works placed our country among the first 4 countries in the world to introduce railways with steam traction: England, the United States of America, France and Russia. But the wonderful initiative of the Nizhny Tagil mechanics of the Cherepanovs did not find support from the serfdom government. Being idle abroad, the Tsarist government preferred to write out locomotives for the first railways from England. The first road of economic importance was the railway between St. Petersburg and Moscow, opened in 1851, now October, and built 9 years. By 1855, the entire Russian railway network was only 980 miles and was 5 times shorter than the French St. Petersburg-Moscow railway. Russian cleavage, and 6 times shorter than the German one. The government also tried to use waterways. In the 40s began to develop commodity, and in the 50s, the passenger shipping company on the Volga. By the middle of the century, along the Volga River, there were already 20 steamers. By that time the first steamship shipyard was built. Technical and economic backwardness of Tsarist Russia. Tsarist Russia lagged technologically and economically, lagging behind the advanced countries of Western Europe. This backwardness is particularly vivid when comparing the economic development of Russia and England. Feudal system of Russia contributed to the strengthening of the technical and economic backwardness and slowing the cultural and socio-political development of the country. At the end of the X8th century, Russia and England smelted the same amount of pig iron, 8 million puds per year. During the first half of the XIX century, Russia doubled this amount and smelted up to 16 million puds, while England increased its smelting almost 30 times and in 1859 smelted 234 million puds. By the mid-1950s, pig iron production in England was 15 times, while in France it was 3 times more than in Russia. The same picture of lagging behind Western Europe was observed in other industries, trade, rail and water transport in Russia. Serf labor was widely used in Russian industry. All the growing backwardness was preparing the inevitable catastrophe of feudal Russia and, above all, the military catastrophe.